Well, good evening and welcome to another episode of your favorite 3M channel. And for tonight, we have a very special guest. Namely, I have Caleb Jackson, who is an apologist and a book author, and he's a guest on many Christian podcasts. So I'm having him tonight. I'm very thankful that he had some time to, take from his busy schedule and to come and share with us. Caleb, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Nicola. It's great to be here and to be able to talk about this. And I know we had planned this out and it was somewhat last minute, but I'm glad I was able to make it work. And as you said, it's just nice to be on to talk about these things. And although I'm trying to go on all the channels that I can, it's always nice to be able to do a different show every time and to get to experiment and do different things. So I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to have a great conversation as always.
Thank you so much for your kind words. I just want to give this as a context before we start. When I was thinking about the whole topic of miracles and near-death experiences, of course, I was thinking about some scholars like Dr. Keener, but then I was thinking about who from my Facebook friends or acquaintances can I have on the channel that is familiar with these topics and that can speak not just based on his own assumptions or subjective thinking, but who is well researched. And I was like, oh, I have no one else better than Caleb Jackson. So, Caleb, can you please tell us something about your work? What made you think and write about topics like miracles, near-death experiences, healings, and stuff like that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's one that I get a lot. So I am, and we had said this before we went live, but I am personally not a charismatic Christian. I'm not Pentecostal. I didn't grow up in an environment that advocated really for healings or speaking in tongues that you would traditionally associate with that. So this wasn't a topic that I'd been thinking about for a long time. When I did my first book on the resurrection, I had a short chapter on miracles, and I think I had like maybe 2 or 3 cases in that book, but it had always left an impact on me, and I always wanted to come back to it. And so I had heard that Craig Keener had this huge scholarly tome, which I have on the bookshelf. 2-volume work on miracles, about 1,100 pages long. And so I got it, and I had heard, it's like, oh, it's a lot of cases and really interesting stuff, pre and post MRIs and medical documentation, like it was proof. And I read the book, and I thought it was a great, a really thorough analysis and had a lot of good cases. But I will admit I was a little bit disappointed that it was a little reliant on anecdotes. Not that I have an issue with anecdotes, but I had imagined it having, like photographs of x-rays and stuff like that. And there's, legal reasons for not being able to show all that as well. But a lot of the cases just didn't, to my surmising, have that good of evidence. And I know you can say it's a cumulative case, but I had wanted to go out and make that book. I was saying, okay, well, is there a book that does have that? And there are a few of them. And I've used that as well. There's a few books, some of them from back in the 70s, some of them are more recent. Candy Gunther Brown has a book published by Harvard on the topic called Testing Prayer, where she does have pre and post medical documentation. But there weren't very many of those books or many resources in general. And I was thinking, if this stuff is happening today, then you hear stories from missionaries all the time about that happening. Why don't we have more evidence of it? So I kind of took the idea of, like, if you want something done right, do it yourself. And so I took those stepping stones of those great scholars like Keener and others, and I wanted to kind of fill in a gap where I saw there was one. So my book is not going to be anywhere near as long as Keener's, and certainly probably not up to the par. But I did want to do a book that had a lot of medical documentation and a thorough analysis. Now, the books that do have medical documentation have relatively few accounts. They typically have maybe about 10 or less, depending on which book you're reading. And they're generally very brief. And a lot of them don't necessarily go over criteria or the ways, or they pick a certain one. So you have books that only talk about Catholic healings. You have books that only talk about Pentecostal healings. And you have books that talk about other signs. But I want to do like an all-encompassing book. So I wanted to have a book that had methodology. I wanted to have a book that had medical documentation. I wanted to have a book that had Pentecostal healings. I wanted a book that had Catholic healings. Basically, just take every bit from all of these other works and combined it and make it like this mega kind of piece, this magnum opus. So that's what I've been working on since early 2021. So about 2 or 3 years now. And I'm hoping that volume 1, by the time that this airs, will probably be out around December or January or so. and volume 2 hopefully will be out by the end of next year. So I'm almost done with volume 1, and volume 2 should be out relatively soon, depending on how I get it published. So that's what I've been working on, and that's where a lot of my research has been. And so I focused a lot on that. I've done quite a few debates, quite a few podcasts, kind of advertising that, teasing that, and I've learned as I've written. So I'm still finishing up the book. I'm still learning things, but it's definitely coming together, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. So hopefully that was a very long-winded but thorough answer to your question.
Oh yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you for that background, because I think that the audience enjoys when they get to know all of our guests. I what I noticed about you, in a lot of your debates, and also when you were as a guest talking about these miracles, like you said, you wanted to provide not just an anecdote, or not just a story, not just an eyewitness report or account, which we're not against, because gospels are eyewitness reports, right? But I love that you wanted to go above that. You're like, hey, let's include science, let's include medicine, let's show the actual reports coming from hospitals and doctors. Like even if am biased, even if I want to be subjective, but check out this signature, or this seal, or this stamp from this doctor, or from this clinic. And I enjoy how you present all these things, and I just love that you're being so professional, even if it takes extra time so you can publish your book. But I believe it will be good, because even if skeptics want to comment, point fingers, oh, maybe this is invented, this, you can always show them, like, well, no, we actually have evidence. And the second thing that I love, not just in your intro but from other videos, is like, yeah, I just don't want to show miracles from my denomination. I want to show from Eastern Orthodox,
Right.
from Catholics, from Pentecostal, from all these different churches, so we can show you that there are all these different accounts of miracles and healings. And I just want to say I respect that, and I believe that both of your books will be amazing. Okay, so when it comes to the first subtopic for tonight, I was thinking maybe we can start with the general topic of healings. I've heard you mentioning over time so many different accounts, so many names, both from the past, from a few centuries ago, and modern. I'll just let you have the freedom of mention any name, and from any country, from any era and period. Can you please share with us some very solid cases of healing that happened either in the States or abroad, either now or a while ago?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So the majority of the book does deal with healings. In fact, almost all of the cases I have are healings. A handful are where there's like a healing related, but it also is like a near death experience or an apparition or so forth. But generally, they are related to healings, and the reason for that is because I think healings are the easiest to document, because it's not just people saying they saw something, although that is part of it, but it's people who are observing someone with a condition who's very sick, right? And they have records of it, and then you're observing someone who's no longer sick, and you have records of it. And these standards of doctors observing patients, we would accept in almost any context. You would accept it in a court of law if the doctor was competent and licensed and so forth. So medical documentation is generally non-controversial. Now, we do know that doctors make mistakes sometimes. Sometimes people have misdiagnoses. Sometimes people exaggerate claims. Sometimes people are psychosomatically sick, right? So you have to be able to account for all of those things. And so when we're looking for a miracle, what we want to do is, if we're trying to rule out a natural explanation, at least to the best of our ability, first we need to say what is a miracle, and then say, well, what would we predict from this? And then we have to look at what's a natural cause for healing, and how do we, what do we know from that, and how could we control for that? So a lot of people define miracle in different ways. I would go with Robert Larmer's definition, where a miracle is basically an act that is caused by God for a specific purpose, a theological purpose that stands out from nature. It's irregular to nature, right? So you have God causing it, you have it being for a specific purpose in a religious context, and you have this idea that it's irregular from nature. So there's kind of the three things you need. So I would say that when I'm looking at a miracle, I would ask, was there a religious context? Did the person just wake up and was better one day? Or did it happen immediately after prayer or going to a religious shrine or something that's relevant to that, right? So that's what we're looking for. And this is why most of the cases I include, it was something that happened either immediately after or very, very closely associated with the religious a prayer or shrine visit or something. It's not going to be where someone prayed to be healed and then 7 weeks later they happen to get better, right? Where you could just say that's a coincidence. We're looking for something to happen at that moment or very close to it. So I think that's one thing that you'd be looking for because of that religious context. Another one is the irregularities, right? How you would say it stands out from nature. But then the question is, well, how do we just know it's not something that's natural that we just don't know yet, right? What does it mean to stand out from nature? And that's where we have to look at what nature defines in terms of its healing. So we know that people can get better with medicine, right? So a miracle healing, I would say, has to happen spontaneously. There's no medication that would have worked. You can have palliative care that maybe improves life, but generally we want to deal with things that are incurable by medicine, or at least medicine was not going to be able to treat it effectively, especially if you have a case where someone's been getting medicine for a while and it clearly hasn't worked, right? And that goes to the second idea, is that people can get better over time, but generally it comes in phases. People have temporary remissions. And if you have a disease that's progressive, right, that is getting worse over time, that you've applied medicine and it does not work or works very minimally, and that the person clearly is getting worse over time with treatment, then that disease is very unlikely to go away by itself, right? That means that your immune system has been fighting it and it's losing the battle. If it's continually gotten worse with age over time for several years, medication hasn't helped, the chances of that going into spontaneous remission are much, much more reduced. So we want a disease that's progressive, that's gotten worse, that hasn't gotten better. Another one is we want it to be something that's organic. We don't want it to be something that's psychosomatic. So people can strangely get paralysis or blindness or deafness or feel really sick, and yet there's nothing actually wrong with them. It's stress. It's in their head. They're worried about something, but when you do a test, there's nothing that shows up on an X-ray that would indicate that there's something wrong with them. So those kinds of illnesses you can get rid of psychologically through suggestion. If you really empower the person, they can basically get themselves out of that. We don't want those cases either, because someone could be prayed for and they could really believe in it and that could get them better, and that's why they got better. We want something that's not going to go away just with the mind, right? A broken bone, a tumor, a genetic disease, those don't just go away because you really, really believe, because the placebo effect, right? There's a lot of limitations to that. Another one we want to be instantaneous, which I already said with the prayer association. So we know the human body is made up of different parts. There's cells, and these cells work together over time. But just like if you were building a building, you wouldn't just have a building show up immediately. You would drive by it and you see that they're building the foundation, then they're building the metal, they're building different parts, and piece by piece it gets built, right? Well, your human body is the same way. You don't have a scab that just instantly closes. You have a cut that becomes a scab, and that scab gets smaller and smaller over time until it gets better. People who have very serious illnesses typically get a gradual recovery. We don't want that. We want someone where they instantly got better, and we want it to be complete as well. So this wasn't just they improved. They got functionally better to where they no longer needed medicine. It was complete healing, either to the same degree before they were sick or close enough to where they're functional, where they don't need medications, right? And the last thing, we want it to be permanent. We don't want someone to relapse, because we know serious diseases can come back. Unfortunately, lots of cases of cancer and neurological conditions do come back, and people think they're healed, and then 5 years later it relapses and they die from it. And those are really sad situations. So if we're looking for a healing that's contrary to nature, that goes against everything we know medicine, we want a healing that has all those characteristics. So that's what we're really looking for in that kind of context. And that's the grind that I'm really judging a lot of these cases behind, right? So you'll get cases that maybe have 6 of those 7 criteria, or 5. The strongest ones are going to have 6 or 7, preferably 7. So I'm not saying that cases that don't have all those aren't miracles. I'm not saying that someone who really thinks they're healed by God, who doesn't have all those checked off, isn't healed by God, but it would reduce my confidence. And I think that the clearest miracles are ones that fulfill all those boxes. So does that make sense? Are there any questions so far?
No, I appreciate this explanation, and I agree with you. So many times we as people of faith are well, both excited but also ignorant, and in a rush to proclaim something as a miracle or healing, while it can be that we just had a good day, or maybe it was, like you said, placebo effect, or maybe it was an adrenaline rush when we didn't feel pain, or something happened, but then the illness, the disease, the pain, whatever is that bothers us, came back later. So that's why my skeptical mind is like, yes, God, I want to see miracles, I want to experience miracles, but also I'm very careful with what I would proclaim as a miracle, especially if I will be working in a situation where you have patients around you. I think you have to be very wise and very careful what you're saying, because if you would be in a position like in some churches to tell people that you're not healed because you don't have enough faith, or some false damaging theology like that, you can spiritually injure people to the point that they can think God doesn't love them or doesn't exist, and they can drift away from the faith. So, in that context, I appreciate your, your introduction.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point you brought up. I think with the theology, I don't believe that it's God's will to heal everyone. A lot of charismatic Christians think that, and I think that reduces people to victim blaming, unfortunately, where they basically said that if you're not healed, it's either your fault because you didn't have enough faith in God, or the person praying for you didn't have enough faith in God, right? But I think just from experience, intuitively, we know that that's not true. I'm not saying that that never happens. Certainly, there are cases where people need more faith, but I would never blame. At least, I would never say for sure that someone's failure to be healed is because they didn't have enough faith. And I think God can use disabilities for greater goods. I mean, if you know Joni Eareckson Tada, she's a very famous painter back in like the, I think, 80s or maybe before that. She was a quadriplegic. She broke her neck when she was diving when she was like 17, I think, and she couldn't move her hands or arms. And so she paints with her mouth. And she was, she wanted to be healed and she never was, but she prayed to God and she felt that was her purpose. And so she makes these beautiful paintings that sell for lots of money. And it's unique because not many people can paint with their mouth. So, taking your situation and making the most of it and still having your faith in God, I think it's a great thing. And so I think there are reasons like that where God doesn't heal everyone, because people can use those disabilities and have a strong testimony and maintain their faith and get through that. It's a trial to overcome, right? So if everyone was healed, it would really, I think, reduce the beauty of that. And the fact that we live in a world where sometimes people have prayers answered, sometimes people don't, it does make a diversity of experience. Prayer wouldn't be special if all prayers were answered, right? Not to say that God answers prayers that he likes someone more than someone else, but I think we all use our situations for our advantage. If God uses our healing to his glory, then that's great. And if God uses our disability to his glory, where we can use that and do a lot of good through that, each side you get a very unique experience that the other person is not going to know what it feels like. So I think in some ways it is sad, because we all know people who've been prayed for who aren't healed, and we always want them to be healed. But I think there is a lot of beauty in being able to overcome our trials like this and being able to hold to faith even when God doesn't always answer our prayers. And so, yeah, I think you were spot on that kind of theology in that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's up to you which cases you want to bring up first. Do you want to go back in the past, or do you want to start with this or that church? I'm completely open to any way, shape, and form you want to start with, cases of healing.
Yeah, so I'm kind of shooting from the hip here, so I'm not going in any particular order. Let's start with a few. I'm going to start with a fairly recent case. Actually, both of these are going to be relatively recent. Let's see. Share screen. All right, presentation. Got that. Can you see that? Yes. I can't see you right now, so if you can see that, yeah, great.
Yeah,
So
everything is good. Thank you.
okay, yeah, no. So I was looking at my screen. I wasn't seeing that. So yeah, verbal. So one case. This is a woman named Daphne Gutierrez, and I believe this happened. I want to say it was 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So Daphne had a condition called pseudotumor cerebri, cerebri, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is basically an idea that a condition where there's pressure and there's fluid built up in your skull, and over time, sometimes this can be drained with surgery, but a lot of times this doesn't always work. And so her particular case, they had tried treating it and it didn't work very well. So she went blind in one eye. I think this was probably in the early in 1999, she started having vision problems. These got progressively worse up into the late 2000s, where she lost major sight in one of her eyes. And then when this condition came, it basically pushes so much pressure on your brain to where it snaps your optic nerve, and it can cause irreversible nerve damage. So although it is possible to treat the fluid and get the fluid out of the head, once that nerve damage has happened, that can't really be repaired, right? It's like if you have a piece of glass and you have a weight on top of it, you can push that down and eventually that glass is going to break. And even if you take the weight off of it, it's going to stay broken. You can't fix it at that point. So she had it to where in the late 2000s, she lost sight in one eye. And then because of the pressure, she had a surgery that failed and ended up snapping it and losing her sight in the other eye. So she was labeled completely disabled and virtually completely blind, severely vision impaired. And this had lasted for a few years. And so she was pretty hopeless in this case. I have some of her medical records there that show her eyesight tests. So she actually was registered to go into a nursing home for care because she couldn't take care of herself. Her kids were taking care of her, but she could barely see. You know, she had to have a cane, read Braille. She had to be trained in the school of the blind, but she could not live on her own because she was completely disabled and not able to have self-care. So a few months before she was supposed to be registered into a nursing home, a living care facility for the rest of her life, and she was only, I think, in her 30s or 40s, so she was pretty young, given this disability. She gets invited to attend a mass, and they have there a relic from Saint Charbel. Now, Saint Charbel was I believe, a 19th century friar or priest at the time, and this was in modern day Lebanon. But he's actually the saint most well known for healing people. Like, he has more claims to healing after his death than I think any other saint does. And so she goes there and she prays and takes the mass, and they put this relic near her eye. And at first, nothing happens, right? She feels invigorated spiritually, but there's not an immediate change. She goes to bed that night and she wakes up because she feels a lot of pain in her eye. She feels a burning sensation. And her husband's at first like, oh, ignore it. She's like, no, my eyes are burning. And she didn't have any sense. She didn't have any any nerves in the eyes that worked, at least to that degree. So she hadn't had any sensation in her eyes for a considerable amount of time. And so she goes back to the doctors, I think, the next day. And at first, there's no change to her vision when they see it. But the day after that, less than 24 hours later, they do a second test, and her eyesight has completely come back, right, after praying for her. And her doctor had no explanation for this because her optic nerves had been damaged. And this is not something that just goes away on its own. It doesn't reverse. And she had been blind for years without any improvement and had only gotten worse prior to that. And so the Catholic Church investigated this. When they, I didn't go into this, I should have started with this, but when the Catholic Church makes someone a saint, typically that person needs 2 miracles, one for beatification and one for canonization. Now, if you're a martyr and you die for the faith, that's different, but most people have to have that. So Saint Charbel had already had his cures prior to that. He was already a saint at this point. But they still had a panel of the local diocese. This was in Phoenix, Arizona, investigate this. And so they had her doctor, who I believe is pictured up there, testing her eyes, look at this. And they had medical reports sent out to several different ophthalmologists. And they came back saying, yeah, there's no medical explanation for this. This is mysterious. We don't know why her sight came back, but it did. And so Daphne believes that Saint Charbel interceded on her behalf and healed her. And this happened, I believe, in 2014, 2013. Her eyesight has still remained same since. She's done interviews years later, and she's still been able to see perfectly fine. She's not had any kind of relapse. So that would be one example of a case of verified blindness pre and post records of something that's medically inexplicable. And so you have a case where this was clearly an organic. It wasn't a psychosomatic idea where she just thought she was blind and wasn't, right? There was objective damage to her nerves. It's progressively gotten worse. First, she lost sight in one eye, then she lost it in the other. Treatment, she didn't have it. The surgery she had didn't work and was like, everyone agreed it was a failure. They tried shunting the eye, and it didn't work. And that was well before she regained her eyesight anyway. But her eyesight had only gotten worse at that point. And then soon after attending the service and praying, within 24 hours or so, she instantly regains her sight back. This isn't a gradual thing where it slowly got a little bit better, then it got a little bit better, and then it got a little bit better. This was something where it all came back within less than a day. This was permanent and this was complete, right? So she doesn't need glasses. This is a complete healing. So I think we have all those factors there. And this is something where it doesn't fit how we understand normal cases of blindness in this way to go away. And so one might say, well, we just don't know what the answer is yet, right? But I think given the context and given what we would expect, we can say reasonably that there was some kind of divine intervention here. Now, whether you or I think that this was actually Saint Charbel interceding, whether we believe that or not, one could say that God had mercy on a woman and doesn't really care about the denomination. But either way, this is a really remarkable case with medical records and doctors testifying that they just don't have an explanation. So I think that would be one example of a pretty well documented case. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I just find it remarkable. But I know that you investigated for your book a number of cases. So, depending on your time, maybe if you can please share with us at least a few more cases so
Yeah,
people can just enjoy, all these testimonies.
absolutely. So give me a second. This is not on my slide, so I'm gonna pull up some of the other things that I had been working on here for another case. So as we talk about, these are cases that are pretty medically inexplicable, and we're doing things. This is not someone who just had a headache or back pain, right? But these are things that are, in all other cases, certifiably incurable, and things that we're not expected to get better. So I think these are things that we have to take in mind here. Why is that not? Hold on. I'm not sure why that's. Give me a second here. All right, that's better. So, Nicola, have you ever seen in your experience what you like? Have you ever experienced a miracle yourself in terms of knowing someone who's experienced it or anything like that?
Uh, I'm not sure when it comes to healing that I've experienced something. I've heard stories
Mm-hmm.
of healing in my church, but I also heard of the stories where people would pray for people who had cancer and people would die. So you hear
Right.
one of my close friends died. He tried to get some more natural form of medical treatment. So he didn't want to do the chemo. He went to this special clinic in another state to get a more I don't know, natural type of healing. And we all prayed for him, and it was getting better and then worse, and then he suddenly died. So I know stories on both spectrum, and like you said, we don't know always why God heals or doesn't heal. um, I was never healed of something that I can remember. um, Maybe I was. So in that way, I don't want to like diminish any of the giving glory to God and just you know um, just forgetting about what he has done for me. But I can't honestly remember that I witnessed something like that, or even though I always wanted to see when I was praying, or some of my friends when we would pray for others, I always wanted to see some, you know, like instant miracle. But I guess
Right.
that's
Right.
a more a form of microwave Christianity, how some people call it. Many times we want to see some instant results. So whatever I do, the same thing with this YouTube channel, with this ministry, I want to see some instant results. But it, God doesn't always work that way. And I'm reminded of the example in the Gospels when Jesus was healing the person, when he would spit and touch, his eyes.
Right.
It was like a process. I mean, it still happened in a day, but it wasn't
Yeah.
just in a second.
It was
So
blurry at first, and then it got better. Yeah. Right.
yeah,
Exactly. It was like a two-step healing. Yeah. Absolutely. That's remarkable. Yeah. And so I personally have never. Okay, there it is. I personally have never experienced a healing on my own. This has always been other stuff I've researched. I have seen plenty of cases where we tried praying for people and it didn't work. So just like you, I think we've all experienced that, and it's always tragic. But I also admit that just because I haven't experienced something doesn't mean that it's not there, right? That you can have it to where other people have seen things, and it doesn't mean they should just believe everyone uncritically. But if there's enough evidence there, you can really find something. So this is a case of two brothers, actually. This is a double healing. So this is Cameron and Caden Sturrs. I don't have a picture of the boys themselves, but I believe at the time they were 9 years old and 5 years old when they were healed. But they were both born with a very rare genetic disease called glycogen storage disease. And this is basically like, you don't really think about diabetes, right? Where you have to watch your blood sugar levels, your glucose levels. They have to take insulin every day, and they have to get their fingers pricked to realize that this is like diabetes, but much, much, much worse in terms of it being like extremely fatal. Not that diabetes isn't dangerous, but this is something that is far more difficult to treat and to stabilize, right? So both of these boys got very sick, and tests showed that they had a particular gene that had caused this. So they go to a hospital. At first, it's in Iowa, and then I believe they go to the University of Florida. They have a special research program there for this disease. And so every day these boys are taking cornstarch. They had to have very high amounts of cornstarch, and they had to get their blood taken 3 times every single day to test to make sure. So you can imagine how exhausted their family was. And so as they get older, as they're getting into their early teens, or at least Cameron was in his early teens. His brother was getting like, I don't know, 8 or 9 at the time. They progressively got more sick. So they had to up the dosages. I believe they first got sick around like 2011 or so, or 2009 maybe. And this got progressively worse. So for the next few years, they're in and out of hospitals constantly. And I don't know if you know much about the Make-A-Wish Foundation, but they're considered terminally ill. So they go to this charity, they have a fundraiser, and they get to go to Disney World because they're not expected to have more than a few years to live with this condition, because usually you don't live very long with this. And so as they go older, this gets worse. And so they have to take more and more cornstarch. Their liver starts swelling up because this really attacks the liver and causes like severe abdomen problems and pain. And so these boys are constantly in pain. These young kids are constantly hurting because their liver's swelling and it's affecting their intestines and stomach and so forth. This picture here is a picture, I believe, from Caden, one of his x-rays. You can see the abnormalities where like the spleen and liver are just inflamed in that way. It looks very painful. So both of them were constantly surgeries, having to have feeding tubes and having to eat cornstarch. So both of them were considered, terminally ill and close to dying. Their mother goes to this healing conference and their mother was very Pentecostal, so she believed in healing and so forth. But she goes to this conference, I believe it was in Illinois, I want to say. They're from Iowa originally, but she goes up to Illinois, and she feels the Holy Spirit telling her to take her kids there. So she takes her kids the next day, and both the pastors lay their hands on the kids and pray for them and say that, I have a word of faith that God's going to heal you, essentially. And both of the boys said that they could feel the disease leaving their body. They felt a lot better at that moment. So normally we could say, well, that's suggestion. It's this placebo effect, right? People feel better afterwards. But the very next day, because remember, they're taking their blood samples 3 times every day because they have to stabilize this. The next day, when they're taking their blood samples, the nurse says for the first time, wow, their samples look normal. Cameron's looks completely normal for the first time. What have we been doing? It's only been getting worse to this point. Caden's had significantly improved, although it wasn't completely normal. So this was in January when this happened. So the next few days, Cameron still maintained normal. And eventually he's like, Mom, I don't want to be taking the cornstarch anymore. So his mom is very reluctant, where she's like, okay, we'll take you off the cornstarch. So they do. And he still maintained, he was still healthy. No problems happened when they took him off the cornstarch. And again, they need this to live. So if you have this disease of going off of cornstarch, that's like not having insulin for diabetes. That's extremely dangerous to be doing. But he did this without any ill effects, and his blood samples still looked normal. Caden rapidly improved over the course of it, and although he wasn't immediately better, he also began to improve where he could eventually be off the cornstarch within a few months and had the feeding tube removed. So within a few months, both of these boys were perfectly healed and perfectly healthy and were able to go off of all palliative care, all palliative treatments. And their doctor had no explanation for this. They're saying this is a disease that is not curable. The only treatments that you can give are stuff to just endure your life, to make it last a little bit longer, like the cornstarch. This can't reverse the effects of it. So they had no explanation for why Cameron and Caden suddenly got better at the same time, right after being prayed for. And these boys are still alive today. Their mom has a Facebook account. She posts pictures of them all the time. This happened about a decade ago now, but they're still alive and healthy. So as far as I know, this is the only case of glycogen storage disease ever going away in this context. And the medical community was not really sure how to explain this, but it is a pretty remarkable instance of healing in this way. And so I think it is interesting that the timing was a little bit different between the two boys, but both of them rapidly either got better or got completely better within 24 hours of that prayer, even though prior to that, they'd only be getting progressively worse. And again, there's no cure for this condition. So I think it's a very uplifting story, and it's really sad when you're seeing these kids, very young kids, dying of a disease, and their mom felt like there was no hope because it's genetic. There's nothing they can do. They can't other than gene therapies, they can't really go out and do anything. So the fact that these boys got completely cured prior to counter to all expectation is remarkable, and certainly she considers it to be a miracle.
Man, I got goosebumps when I was listening. I don't know these people, but like the whole story is like
Right.
filled with this supernatural presence and power of God, and I enjoy these things and eyewitness reports, especially when they're not just um, you know like rumors. If they're backed up, like with all the details that you're giving, these things
Right.
boost up my faith so much, and my joy and my thankfulness and my emotional side like somehow is able to be shown more when God touches that soft spot in my heart like no one else can. So I enjoy these stories.
Absolutely, and it's so encouraging to see that, especially when people are in such dire situations that you just sometimes do feel, hopeless to that degree. And so it's really uplifting to see that. Give me another second. I'm trying to pull up another one here.
Yeah, while you're doing that, I just want to say that
Yeah, go
recently,
ahead.
my friend's dad back home in Europe was healed. I don't know all the details, but I remember several months ago when I was texting through the Facebook Messenger with my old church friend back home, and I know his dad was doing so poor he had to retire early from work. He was a cab driver. He was having
Wow.
some type of was it cancer or tumor? Sometimes these things are the same or very similar. Uh, and it didn't sound good. It sounded like his life expectancy is not going to be too long. So we may be approaching the day where we'll be just saying goodbye to him. And then I was just checking on my friend a few other, few days ago, and I was like, "Hey, man, how's your dad doing?" And he said, praise God, he's healed and he's back to work. He has no traces of cancer in his blood. When the results were when the doctors did the results recently, he's completely cancer free. He didn't give me the details, probably he doesn't know either, but I was amazed. I honestly, this may sound bad, but I didn't have that much faith that I would hear news like that when I was asking my buddy about his dad. So I was
Right.
just amazed. I was like floored. I'm like, thank you, God. Like more than that, I don't know what to say. So I just heard several days ago. I was just amazed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is those are really great stories. And I think everyone knows someone who's had cancer or suffered from that. I have I know people, and there was someone who went to my old church, father. He was my friend's dad, who got, I think it was colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, and he's still in chemo right now. But he had been prayed for, and he originally had a remission, but it came back. So this is why you have to be very careful, right? Because sometimes people get better, and then cancer especially can come back again. So you have to be very careful of that. And cancer can also go away on its own sometimes by spontaneous remission, but it really depends on the details. How fast did it go away? Did they have chemotherapy? So I do have a few cancer cases, and I don't mean to undermine those, but sometimes I do. I am a little hesitant about using cases like that for that reason. So here's another one I have. Give me a second. This is one I had on Facebook in one of the groups. I have the other details, but I didn't upload it. Oh, hold on. I forgot to give me a second. See, this is how you know we're doing this in terms of not planning ahead, because you're committing me on being so prepared before we start, and yet I'm kind of just doing these on the fly as they come to me. So I didn't really have in mind which ones I was going to do and which ones I'm not, but that's fine. I think
It's okay. It's also my fault because we were scheduled to have this conversation a few days from now, and then something happened with my schedule. So I was like, "Hey, Caleb, can you do it Friday?" So
yeah, yeah.
don't worry.
Oh, it's fine, but we're still doing it, and it's great. So there we go. I'm trying to get that on there. I'm trying to bring up stuff. That's not what I thought it was going to be, though. I'm trying to scroll through YouTube right now and bring up one of the things I had saved on here, but I'm trying to find it. So give me just a second. So this is a case of a. Do you know what the Paralympics are?
Yeah.
Yeah, where they have like disabled I'm trying to think, disabled athletes who can participate in things. I do have a case of an athlete who was in the Paralympics, so he was certified disabled in that way, and he managed to get better again. It was captured on film, and I'm trying to find the clip I had of it where he's getting up, but we could just link it later or something like that. But I do have at least a few pictures. So let me find that. Oh, that's not it. Hold on. All right. Can you see that? Yes?
Yep. Yeah, it's
Great.
all good.
All right. I can see that now. Sorry, I was trying to switch screens. So, yeah, this is someone named Bill Kent. So this is a photo, I believe, from I want to say 88 or so. And so Bill had been injured in a motorcycle accident back in 1985. So he had been, I believe he was hit by a train when he was driving his motorcycle. And he ended up being a paraplegic. So he was unable to move his legs. He was paralyzed on his left side with his left arm, and his optic nerve was also severed. So I believe he was blind in one eye as well. So he was stuck like this, and so he made the most of it and became an athlete in the Paralympics. So he won, I believe, several gold and silver medals in rifle shooting, where you would be target shooting, among other Paralympians from his wheelchair. So he did this in Seoul in South Korea in 1988, and this is a newspaper that's reporting on it. And there's plenty of other records. If you just look up Bill Kent Paralympics, you can see the original. I believe even the Washington Post mentions it at the time from back in the 80s when this happened. So he was paralyzed for about 15 years or so. In the year 2000, in November, he goes to Ohio for a service where he's prayed for, and for the first time he feels warmness in his feet, right? He feels heat, and he jumps out of his wheelchair for the first time. And again, this is on video, but I had trouble finding it on there, where he's able to walk for the first time in 15 years. And it's a little stiff because your muscles naturally have atrophy when you haven't walked in well over a decade, and yet he's still able to move and do all this now. And so that's the last time he used the wheelchair. He was able to walk from that moment on, and when he was on other interviews, he would give his medical records, and he would name his doctors, Dr. Arthur Horn and Dr. Dino Delaportis, who were around Hagerstown, Maryland, which is his hometown. And he would give quotes from them and so forth. And there's other newspapers afterwards of him. He became a police officer after this, or at least I think it was a chaplain for the police, or some kind of squad car, where he would do this, and you can see pictures of him, walking and doing all that stuff. So it's pretty verifiable that he was sick prior to that. You can look at all his athletic achievements prior to that. There's video of him getting up and walking for the first time, and there's records including doctor's records mentioning him being able to walk perfectly fine after that. Now, when you have serious paraplegia, people sometimes can get temporarily paralyzed where they can walk it off and it can wear off after a few months or so with rehabilitation, right? But you don't have people who are quadriplegics for well over a decade suddenly getting the ability to walk again instantaneously, right? Especially without any kind of rehab or any rehabilitation or treatment, which he did not have in this case. So you do have a pretty good case, I would say, in this situation where Bill was really paralyzed and was able to walk again after being prayed for and was certifiably walking. Now, the ironic thing is that when he was a police officer in 2010, so a decade after he was healed, he actually got injured a second time because a car hit him while he was doing, I forget if it was traffic or something with his job. So he was in a wheelchair a second time, but this time he did get better naturally within a few months. He went to rehab, and he was able to walk it off, and he's okay now. But it is a little darkly ironic that someone who spent 15 years in a wheelchair, who was healed, temporarily got sick again, but for unrelated reasons. So, but he did get out of that, relatively normally. And it's a big contrast when you see how he got better normally within a few months, contrast to how he had been sick for over a decade without improvement. So that would be another case, and one that I have a photo up there. So yeah, a lot of people wonder, we want something that's visibly true. We don't just want people who have stuff on the inside like cancer or blood diseases that we can't see. We want something that's visibly obvious, and someone who has atrophied muscles and paralysis on the left side, an eye patch in that picture, blindness on his left, on one of his eyes, and complete paraplegia is pretty apparent to most people, and it clearly wasn't psychosomatic in this case, given that he was in a car accident, had permanent spinal cord injury and head and enclosed head injury. So I think it's another pretty remarkable case of a healing.
Yeah, it's amazing. And what is also amazing is that once when he got healed, he wasn't just passive or, I don't know, just trying to enjoy his life. No, he went to become a police chaplain so he can be there comforting others
Right.
and serving them, because he knows well what is pain and suffering and waiting for God to intervene in your life. So I love that aspect as the final layer of this beautiful story of healing. But then when you're healed, you go and serve and tell others. Just the gospel story, like when Jesus was healing, people, and they will go and tell others, like, "Hey, look what this guy just did for me." So it's just amazing.
Absolutely, and that's a good point too, because a lot of people who get healed themselves go on to become healers and have their own ministries, or at least pray for people. I've interviewed someone. It's on the channel called Exploring Reality, but it's in the book as well, of a kid who he had a digestive disorder where he had to have a feeding tube. He couldn't eat normally for 16 years. He'd been born with it, and he was prayed for and instantly got better. And it was actually published in a medical journal. But the person who prayed for him also had been healed of a intestinal disease. He had lost part of his intestine; it grew back. But it's kind of funny that you have similar people with similar conditions praying for each other, them getting better. Like, if that's what the gift of healing incorporates. So it is really, I think it's really fascinating. Here's another one that I did. I actually wrote a paper on this one. I have it brought up this time, so it won't take me nearly as long to get it there. There we go. So this is another Catholic one, going back, because we've been doing a few Pentecostal ones. So this is on academia, if anyone is interested in.
Well, I love that page. I use it frequently.
Yeah, academia, right? Yeah, doing that. So I call it fractured. But if you know of, if you've ever heard of Lourdes before, it's a famous pilgrimage site in France, and they believe that the Virgin Mary appeared there in 1858 to a 14-year-old girl and told her to dig in a certain location. When she did, there was a spring of water, and the people there believed the water had healing properties. So people started drinking it and bathing in it, and people started reporting getting better. And these became so common, these claims were so common, they had to set up a medical bureau to investigate these. And so people still go there, even today. Thousands of people go there every year, if not millions. And there's 70 approved official miracles, approved being that the medical bureau investigated them and certified there was no medical explanation, that they fit criteria. That's not all the ones that have been healed. There's other ones that weren't that people were healed and they just didn't report it and so forth. But that's between, people would say that's less than 1%, but the math gets a little bit tricky there when you count the other ones that aren't reported. So this is one of the most famous cases. This happened in the mid 1800s, and it didn't even happen in Lourdes. Actually, it happened at a shrine that was a replica of it, which is kind of funny. The only one that didn't happen at the actual site, but it's one of the most remarkable ones and also one of the most controversial ones. So I won't say the whole thing here because I wrote a whole paper. So if you really want the details, you can read this paper. But this involves a Belgian man by the name of Pierre de Roudet. I believe that's how you say it. It's French. If I'm butchering that, European languages better than I do, but that's how it is. So Pierre had been a laborer in 1867, and while they were working, a tree they'd been cutting down fell on top of his left leg and completely shattered his tibia and fibula, like the bones below the femur, tibula and fibula. And you could see the scars from that there. So this was taken after he was healed, by the way. But the bone was actually sticking out of it. So that's why it was this big wound on the foot and on the leg. So he had to be operated on by a doctor, and the doctor tried and couldn't fix it. So there was a 3-centimeter gap of separating the bone. So his bone was disconnected. So he was given a pension and put on basically permanent disability. He still had doctors visit him every once in a while just to care for his wounds. But he had stayed on this pension up until 1874 or so. And he had, at this point, constantly asked his owner to help him go to a shrine, the replica of Shrine of Lourdes, which was in Belgium at the time, sitting near him. and because he couldn't afford to go to the real one. And his boss always was like, no, I'm not gonna do that. His boss was a skeptic, a rationalist. This was after the Enlightenment, so his boss did not believe in miracles, didn't want to waste his money and time paying for his employee to go to this thing that would be a waste of time. So his boss said, look, I'll give you medical treatment. I'll give you doctors to help care for your wounds, even though you're probably permanently disabled, but I'm not paying for your trip. I don't believe in that stuff. So Pierre remained sick for about 7 years. He was on crutches. He got a little bit better to where he could go to mass. His leg was ripped up, was up in bandages, and he would hobble on crutches to mass and pray. And people around the town knew him as the cripple, but he never got better. So in 1874, his boss dies and is replaced by a relative who I think was his nephew. And he ends up doing some refinancing of the company. And he's like, well, we don't need to be paying Pierre his pension anymore because he's not working. So we have to prioritize. So he cuts Pierre off from his pension. So at that point, Pierre, who's still bedbound, his family, his wife and daughter have to go get jobs now. This was in the 1870s. So women didn't really work that much back then. So it was a big deal for them to have to get jobs. And they had been caring for him up to this point. They've been treating his wounds. And so they had to go get jobs. And so 8 months after this, eventually his boss lets him go and says, fine, I'll have you go to your trip. So the day before he does, a couple days before he goes to the trip, his neighbors see him and he basically explains to him that he's going to go there, and he takes the bandages off and he shows them the bone. They can see the naked leg and the bone sticking out of it, broken. And they were discussing he could turn his foot around and all that stuff. And his boss's wife also, when he goes and asks if he could go, his boss's wife wanted to see the leg, and so he unwraps it and shows her. And she says, when she testified to this, that the bone was snapped and that the wound smelled so bad and had such a foul odor. It was pus was covering it. Very, very gross, right? So he goes to the Belgian shrine in early April of 1875. People on the train noted how that he looked like he was in pain. He was on crutches. His wife was there with him, but the leg basically hung loose. He didn't move it. Like he was limping it the whole time. He didn't have autonomy of it. So he goes to the shrine and prays to the Virgin Mary and says, he feels like he's been a bad dad because he hasn't been able to take care, and he feels guilty that his wife and daughter have to work now. And so he prays just for the ability to get better, for the ability to his family to have health again, and for the ability to be able to work. And even if he can't get back to work, that he can at least be able to provide for his family, or that there can be some way, because they were just stressed out about this. As he's saying that, the bandages of his leg fall off, and he looks down, and the bone has been reconnected. The muscles have gone over the leg. The skin has gone over the leg. He doesn't know how to react. He gets excited and starts jumping around and makes a scene, and everyone's like staring at him, right? Because it's a big deal. And so he's investigated by this the next few days. He goes and people look at his leg. We have signed documents from literally days after this happened, less than a week after this happened, of people saying, we knew Pierre for years. He went to our church. He would always come in crutches. We know his leg was broken. We testify that his leg is now better. We have witnesses, his neighbors, who saw the leg broken. They signed an affidavit, a sworn affidavit 2 weeks after that, where they said, yes, we saw a couple of days before the bone had really been broken. He showed it to us with our own eyes, and his leg is better now. Now, he still had the scars, which you can see on these pictures from this, but they were closed over scars. So that's what we have initially. So after he died, about I think it was in the 1890s or so, there were investigations in this, and there were people who tried to come up with alternative theories. So there were some people who suggested, and they had a lot of witness testimony, right? But some people were suggesting that, well, maybe Pierre was faking being hurt. Maybe he really did break his leg, but it got better, and he was faking being sick for many years because he was on a pension. He didn't want to work, right? And so, it happens that when he got better, when his pension was revoked away and he's not getting money, suddenly he's like, my leg is better, guys. I can work again, right? So some people have been suggesting that he may have been faking it, right? Well, I go into a lot of detail in terms of this on the paper, so I'm not going to explain all of it here. But I don't think that works for many reasons. I think that there's enough witness testimony that his leg really was broken a few days before, including from a doctor or two, that we can be pretty confident that it wasn't. I also don't think that there's much motivation, because even when he lost his pension, he still was out of work and was not getting any money for 8 months, which is quite a long time to keep doing this when you're not getting paid. And his family, his wife and daughter attested to this. And although you could say, well, maybe they're biased, right? Maybe they did this. They claim that they took care of his leg every day, but they went end up getting jobs. So if they're in on this lie, I don't know what advantage they have to having to work if they know that he's lying. If they know that he actually can work, what advantage do they have for having to get jobs while he sits on his bed all day, not able to work, if they knew he was really cured again, right? And I don't think you could say that he was tricking them, because they claimed they were fixing his leg and cleaning the pus off of it every day. So I don't think they could honestly be mistaken about that. So for all those reasons, I think it's unlikely. Plus, he went back to work for his boss once the healing happened. He didn't try to get money for being famous or anything like that, from what we can tell. So I think there's a lot of reasons why this isn't very plausible. But after he died, when they're doing the investigation, they actually dug up his bones, which is what we have here. You can actually see, so you can tell the leg on the, well, it's technically the left leg, but it's on the right, it's face fronting. You can tell that it was broken and that it was healed. So that's an incomplete healing, right? It's a malunion. So the bone unnaturally didn't heal properly, but it was still functional. So he was able to walk with it without any canes, without any kind of orthopedic shoes. This is an x-ray taken of it as well. This is actually it's not the first, it's actually one of the first x-rays. This was taken in the 1890s. X-rays had just been invented. So this is actually one of the very first x-rays ever taken of this. And so it's kind of cool. That's the context. This is of the tibia. You see the fibula right there of that in that way. So I go into a lot more detail in the paper if you want the back and forth in terms of the arguments for and against it. But that's a case where you have something that's so impossible to get wrong, right? Where you have a bone literally sticking out and instantly healing. That's not something you're gonna be able to say is a placebo effect or just a misdiagnosis, right? Like, it's almost impossible to be wrong about that. So I think the only explanation you could give is that he was lying, because you couldn't really be mistaken about something like a bone instantly closing and the wound closing, right? So it is an interesting case for sure, and it's probably the most well-known one from Lourdes.
Yeah. I think we're okay with I mean, we can talk about all these accounts of healing the whole night, and it will be amazing, but we need
It would take a while because there's so many we could do. Right?
Yeah, we need to dedicate time to some other miracles and near-death experiences. But I just want to ask you two quick controversial questions, if that's okay, regarding healing.
Yeah.
Ready? Okay. The first one, when you talk about either Eastern Orthodox or Catholic type of healings, when either Virgin Mary or saints are involved, do you get any negative feedback and pushback from us Protestants, evangelical believers? You're also one of us. And the second, first, if you can please answer that, and then I'll ask you the second controversial question.
So I actually really haven't, to be honest, and I'm surprised, right? Because I would expect to get more, but I don't really know what to do with those, to be honest. I say in the book, I throw my hands up and I say, I don't know what to think of these, because my theology doesn't really agree with it, but I also want to try to be not as biased. I want to be as least biased as I can, as unbiased as I can. And so there are sometimes things where I just say, like, I don't really know. And I can see why people would just hold judgment. When I was on Cameron Bertuzzi's show on Capturing Christianity, the last case we talked about was one where the Virgin Mary allegedly appeared in on top of an Orthodox church. And there's photographs of it. I go into that there.
I saw it. It was amazing.
Yeah, it is. Amazing. And I said, I don't know what to think. Like, there's part of me that's like, well, if you're going to grant this was something supernatural, let's just grant that. If it was an angel, right? I've had Protestants, well, that maybe it was an angel people thought it was Mary. It's like, that's true. Although it seems weird that God would let people just falsely believe that they'd be under this grave misapprehension. He wouldn't correct it. He wouldn't make it more obvious that, oh, I'm not the Virgin Mary, I'm an angel, right? And so people really believed this. And so does God just not want to correct it if it's a false belief? So I don't really know what to think. And I think it's really fascinating. And part of that scares me, because I know that the Catholic Church, even though this was an Orthodox miracle, but the Catholic Church says that if you don't affirm the Assumption of Mary, then the wrath of St. Peter and John will be on you in Judgment Day. So part of that does give me a little bit of anxiety, but part of it's also fascinating to me. And I think it's intriguing, and I want to learn more. And the mystery just makes me think harder about it. So no, I have not had Protestants, not many of them have pushed back on that. They're most like, well, God can heal people. It's not that surprising. Most of my friends, at least, are like, yeah, Catholics are Christians. We're not going to call them cults or anything like that, right? It's a little extreme. Although I have had a few Catholics who've pushed back and said, well, no, these are clearly, Caleb, this is evidence for Catholicism, right? You should become Catholic because saints praying for people, Mary, like, come on, why aren't you Catholic, Caleb, if you think there's such good evidence for some Catholic miracles? And I don't know. I think that it goes both ways. I think there's miracles on both sides, and I'm not sure that God is trying to vindicate any particular denomination here, So it's not strong enough for me to be Catholic, at least, but I've had Catholics who get more upset at me for not converting to Catholicism because of that than I have had Protestants for me talking about it. So it's funny.
Yeah, honestly, I'm surprised. I was expecting some of the hardcore Protestants, especially coming from the Reform side, to come and say, "Hey, just because supposedly Virgin Mary showed herself to someone, it could be demonic manifestation." Just as we know, Paul was warning us that the Satan can portray himself as the angel of light, or like, hey, some healings, even though they happen, even Satan has some supernatural abilities. That doesn't mean it was God. So I was expecting, some of that pushback that you get in your work so far. But if you didn't get, I guess that's good.
Yeah, and I
And my
don't ever like saying it's Satan because anyone can pull that card. Any religion you don't like can say, "Well, your religion is satanic and the devil's doing it," right? I don't think it gets you anywhere.
Yeah. And the second question is, oh my gosh, I think this is an even more controversial question. Okay, so for anyone who has been a believer for a long time and it belongs to that in that big umbrella of Protestant, church and all its denominations, we have all heard about Todd White, right? Some people love him who are more uh, ultra core Pentecostals and charismatic. Some people like me, we are prone to just be skeptical by nature and like, hey, I don't want to just have blind faith and believe everything I hear from other people. So over time, Todd White has extended or expanded his street ministry, but all these supposedly healings where he would see people, he would like, hey, I saw that your legs are not aligned. Can you lay down? And I'll like help, through me, God will heal you, help you walking. And some Christian apologists and theologians will be like, well, look, the technique he's using, he's not aligning. There is a catch, there is a trick, there's no healing. And I became so disappointed, so suspicious years ago. And for me now, unfortunately, this name is associated with false healings or false alignments of legs. So it just bugs me, and I wanted to ask, in your research, what do you think about all these supposedly faith healers who, it's not just about this name. I have nothing personal against this person. I'm just giving example as we know these people, faith healers, coming from all these churches, yet even though they may call themselves as faith healers, they themselves are not always healed. They die. And sometimes the testimony of supposed healings and miracles come back as to be, no, these people, these patients were not actually healed. So I just wanted to hear your opinion.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I actually have a whole chapter on faith healers in the book. I share your skepticism. I think most big ministries have a lot of motivation for lying to get money, right? Especially they're making a lot of money. So you have to be very careful about that. And as you said, the leg lengthening thing is a common trick. You pull the shoe out a little bit so it looks like the leg's growing. And that's something where they know that they're lying, right? They know that they're conning people. I don't know if you've ever heard of Peter Popoff before. He was a very famous case in the 80s where he would heal people, and not only heal people, but he would be able to say things like, "Oh, Sally, you live on this street," and he would tell things people about personal lives that they didn't know, right? And this was a miracle. Well, James Randi, who is a magician, came in and he found out that the healings were being fake, that this was a lot of placebo stuff. And he found out that they signed prayer cards at the beginning of these ministries that were collected. And these prayer cards, they would put personal information. So Peter Popoff they noticed there was plastic in his ear. And they said, well, either he has a hearing aid, which is weird if he's a healer, right? Or he's having an earpiece. And so they actually intercepted the waves and they played this on TV. But his wife was in a van using a walkie-talkie, reading them off, saying, okay, Barbara is in the third row. She has arthritis. And Papa would be like, God is telling me, Barbara, where are you with arthritis? Yes, the Holy Spirit is telling me this. And taking people's money, complete con artist, right? And so when he was exposed, he went bankrupt. But he now he's still in business today, by the way. He sells miracle spring water now that you can buy, miracle water that'll solve all your debts, cure any disease, all this stuff that you can buy for, 3 easy payments of $19.99 or whatever it is. So he's still conning people for money, unfortunately. But it is a truth. If you know Benny Hinn, very famous faith healer as well, there was a whole expose on him where they found out that he was basically, people in his staff were deliberately excluding people who were like actually sick. So they take people who had cancer or stuff that wasn't very visible, right? And they think they were healed. But there would be people who'd come with like their kids who had cerebral palsy in a wheelchair or missing limbs, like really serious diseases, and they would like say, no, you're not going to go on stage. Like, he's not going to pray for you. And deliberately so picking people who would be easy to do. So very disgusting things, and it's really sad. But I also try not to, I try to be open-minded, not so open-minded where I'm just gullible, but I do try to keep it in mind. I don't say that can't happen, that there can't be ministries like that, but we should definitely be skeptical. There was one faith healer who I think actually has some pretty credible cases, and that her name would be Catherine Kuhlman, and she died in the 70s, but she was very weird and eccentric. And there were plenty of people who she prayed for who were not healed. So I'll say that there was a doctor who investigated her, and he followed up on 10 people, and all those 10 people were actually not healed, or they had placebo effect or something. So she never claimed that she could heal everyone. I'm not saying that, but there were a lot of really interesting cases, and I talk about them in the book, of people who got better with medical documentation. She was one of the only faith healers who actually, in order for you to give a testimony on her show, you had to have medical documentation of the disease that got better. So she actually was trying to be pretty good, and she had a lot of friends who were medical doctors. And there was a book published in the 70s by Richard Kazadorf, who was a John Hopkins doctor who worked at, I think it was a Heart Center in California. It was Long Beach Hospital, I think it was, which is a pretty well-respected hospital. It's a national landmark now. But he wrote a book where he had 10 cases of people, and he had pictures of x-rays and scans stuff pre and post. And some of the cases are really remarkable. I think the best one of hers was a woman who had a woman in her 30s who had severe osteoporosis, which is where your bones thin up, right? So when she was 30 years old, she had the bones of a 70-year-old woman. And her spine, literally, like the vertebrae would pop out, they would disconnect, and she had to have 4 surgeries where they had to connect it back. And every time it would only temporarily work, and it would pop out again. So after the 4th time, they said, look, we can't fix this. There's nothing we can do. So they had to give her a cordotomy, this was back in, I think, the 60s when she had this happen. But before they had a lot of opioids and painkillers, a cordotomy was like something they only give to terminal patients, only if you're dying of like cancer and you don't have long to live anyway, just to relieve your pain. They go in and they basically sever the nerves to where you have no feeling on the side of your body at all. So she was in such pain, no pain medicine works. They literally did this to where she had no feeling in her body, like on the left side and then on her leg down. And that worked for a little bit, but then she had a bad fall and the pain came back. And so she had basically spent years, and this is a woman in her 30s, mind you, with the bones of a 70-year-old woman. Her her vertebrae kept popping out. She had to have a neck collar, and she had to have a back brace. She was in bed, I think, 22 hours a day. She can only get up for maybe 3 hours a day and do it. So she was in absolute hell, absolute pain. And she had there was an x-ray taken in August. She was healed in 1975, and there was an x-ray taken a month before that showed her getting worse. And her doctor was like, yeah, she probably only has a few months to live at this point. But she goes to a conference where Catherine Kuhlman is giving a lecture. She wasn't even doing it. And Kuhlman was not even praying for her. Kuhlman was praying for someone else on stage. And while Kuhlman is praying for her, Dolores is in the audience in her big body cast and her big collar on there. And she starts feeling like this kind of heat pain in the back of her neck. And at first she thought it was like she was putting pressure on like her vertebrae, and that's what it was doing it. But she gets up and she goes outside, and she's very uncomfortable. And there was a doctor who follows her out of there who was in the audience. And he's like, what's wrong? And she's like, I don't know. My neck feels really funny. And he's like, look, you're going to have to trust me on this, but I feel like God's healed you. I have the Holy Spirit doing that. So reluctantly, they go back on stage and they tell Kuhlman what happened. So she takes off her collar, takes off the body cast, and starts walking for the first time. Now, mind you, she couldn't walk normally prior to this because she had no feeling in her body, right? So before this, she had to shuffle. She couldn't move her legs up. She had to shuffle on the ground. So she lifts her legs up and starts doing it. She doesn't have pain. She goes back to her doctor a few days later, and Kastorf has the records and the x-rays. Her vertebrae now is connected. Her spine is completely straight. The scar of where it was sticking out is closed over. She has no more pain. Again, her spine's straight. She can't even fit into her body cast now because she can stand up straight. She doesn't have the scoliosis and the osteoporosis. Doesn't need the collar anymore. Is completely healed and completely symptom-free. Now, take in mind, osteoporosis is a disease that does not have a cure. You can treat it to where it reduces symptoms, but this is something where it only gets worse with age. So she'd had this in her 30s. It had gotten worse for, I think, 16 years she'd had this, where it got progressively worse and worse. Treatments did not help at all. Like, the surgeries clearly didn't have effect. But she was healed, and this was in the 70s. She died, I believe, in the early 2010s at the age of 80 or so. So she was healed for 40 years. in complete health, didn't get any worse, completely healed, no symptoms returned, no relapse, which again is unheard of considering how bad of a condition she had been in before then, terminal. So that's a case from Catherine Coleman. I don't agree with everything Catherine Coleman has ever said, but I think you could say God works through people, and I think that's a case that's just so remarkable where I just can't ignore and just say, oh yeah, that's just psychosomatic, right? And especially if there's documentation to back it up. So I think it's just a remarkable case and really uplifting. And she became a pastor after that. She had her own healing ministry. Dolores did, the woman who was healed, and she'd pray for people and try to heal them too. So she felt like that was what God wanted her to do, to try to give that to other people. So
Yeah, there's a couple of things. There's a thing that bugs me in a lot of faith healing ministries, or when people are, doing spiritual warfare and they're trying to rebuke demons. I noticed then that in both instances, a lot of people are using uh, terminology when they would command either sickness or a demon to go. They
right.
would, many times they would say, "I command you to go," or something like that, and that bugs me a lot. I'm like, you are just a vessel.
Yeah.
You are just an instrument that God is using. Why not focusing on Jesus and His name instead of yourself? You can say, I command you in the name of Jesus to go, or I tell you in the
Yes.
name of Jesus be healed. But do not think for a second that you're the one healing. Do not think for a second that you're
Right.
the one, exercising your own authority over demons or powers or whatever. So that is one thing. The second thing, because I've been listening carefully, to what you've been saying all night. Uh,
Yeah.
I noticed that whenever the healing starts, I won't say it's always like that. I'm not trying to generalize, but at least from your stories, and by the way, I'm amazed how all these small details you're able to remember. I would need notes for all these
Oh
details.
no, I've done it so many times now. I
Amazing.
can just off that, like, yeah.
Yeah. So I notice in all these healing stories, there's always first this presence, warmth, and I don't know why I'm tend to, my brain is so weird. I tend to like overthink, and I tend to visualize a lot, and I tend to like space out and get lost. But I had episodes of people who were like being involved in spiritual warfare, dealing with fallen principalities, which the Bible calls Elohim, which are not demons. That's another topic. I did few episodes of that.
Mike Kaiser, yeah.
And yeah, so in their case, like when they would personally experience, or people that they would interview and work with, what these people would experience is like there would always like this cool air come in their house or in their presence. But then when God is healing, warm air and warmth is coming in their bodies. So again, when you're talking, I was spaced out and thinking about cold and warm air, the atmosphere, and I don't know if there is any connection, but I see the opposite way God is working than demonic principalities and Satan. So I was just making that as a parallel, even though we cannot compare these things, but there's so much different how God works. Like you don't have to be afraid. There's no way that He's gonna hurt you. That warmth is pleasant, and I felt this warmth, a
Right.
warm presence many times when I would worship God, sing to Him, or if I would have to either preach when I was in jail, working as a chaplain,
Mm.
where well volunteering, or had to defend my faith, in unexpected places. So the more I would be, preaching, teaching, defending the faith, sometimes I will feel this, you know, like. Like electric sensation in both of my arms, but sometimes like even this heat like in my chest. So I just want to say it's a beautiful feeling. It's way different than how people who are demonically oppressed, it's way different how they would portray their anxiety, their fear, but also this cool presence where they will be like freezing. But God is so gentle, and like He's basically your best friend.
Yeah, and I like how you brought it up. Actually, I hadn't thought about the satanic, like the coldness being contrasted, but I do have a chapter in the book where I talk about features that are shared among these cases, and what you pointed out is exactly something that I've noticed on my own that I thought was so interesting. That you have accounts that are independent of each other where they always mention, or very common to mention, almost always they'll say it was either heat or like electricity is how they describe it. And usually it's like that's how they think the Holy Spirit is. But usually it starts off as slightly painful and uncomfortable. Like people, like the Bill Kent case where people are in wheelchairs, they'll have feeling in their legs which they don't have, right? And then it'll literally be so uncomfortable they'll have to jump up and like start putting their feet on the ground because they're like trying to pan it out, and then they realize, wait, I can move my feet. Like it's a thing where it's like it's kind of hurts. Same with like the blindness, right? Where it's like almost a sharp pain, and then they realize that they can see. And there have been some people who've said that maybe that's because the nerve endings are coming back for the first time, that feeling's coming back, and that's why those nerve endings switch on. That's the heat. I think could also be like the idea of the Holy Spirit being a fire, like, you know, tongues of fire in Pentecost. But that is something that I've definitely noticed, and I thought that was so interesting to how these different accounts have that. And I think this would be an argument if you have a lot of these accounts. You could say, well, maybe it's just some unknown natural thing. But if you have these accounts that share these similarities, right, and they're all in religious context, then it seems like that's something we should look at in terms of maybe this is the same cause, if it's the same kinds of effects of this heat, maybe it's the Holy Spirit. So yeah, I think that was a great point, and something that's really interesting that doesn't get mentioned as much as it really should, because it's fascinating how that there's that connection that a lot of people don't see.
Caleb, I want to be respectful of your time. So if it's okay, I think we can leave the topic of resurrection for another whole episode in itself, for some time in the future, because I don't think it will be fair to touch on such an important and magnificent event in the history, just to summarize it for 5 minutes. So if you agree, we can skip maybe a topic for that and make an episode in itself when it comes to, the resurrection, some other miracles, which I posted in the outline, like creation, human design. We can also touch about that in some other time. But maybe if we can, finish this, this episode for tonight by talking about some of the near-death experiences that you encountered in your research. Can you please explain to us, for all of those who don't know, what are near-death experiences? Are they possible to be verified by medicine? Are there any scholars who are dealing with this, so it's not just rumors? And what is your conclusion when it comes to this topic that you've been dealing with?
Yeah, so I will say off the bat, I've not looked into them as much as I have with miracles. I do have a few cases in the book, but those usually have healing to do with them. But I do, from what I have read, and there's a whole journal that publishes, peer-reviewed journal, University of Virginia, Journal of Near-Death Studies, that people publish on this. And there's a lot of back and forth in literature, but you'll have cases where people have no noticeable heartbeat and brain activity, and they claim to see things. And so some people say it's a hallucination or so forth. And the question is, well, can you be hallucinating if you don't have any brain, at least measurable brain activity? And so there's debates as to whether people simply see things, because the best argument against is that there's a lot of inconsistency. So if you're a Hindu, your near-death experiences usually involve Hindu gods. If you're a Christian, it usually involves Mary or Jesus, right? So some people say that a lot of it is culturally relative, and I think that's partially true. And so in many cases, I would doubt if someone just says, I just went to heaven and that was it. Like, I can't verify that or not. I did have a grandmother who, she actually did die of COVID a few years ago. But prior to that, about 20 years before that, when I was an infant, I think it was like about 2000 or so, she was dying of another condition. I don't remember what it was off the top of my head. But she had a near-death experience, and she thought she saw her dead family members, and she remembers the tall, beautiful green grass running through, and everyone was so happy. And she really believed that she had seen a glimpse of heaven. She always talked about how she wanted to get to the whole thing again. And I'm not in a position to say whether she had some kind of medicine-induced hallucination from that or whether that was really heaven. I don't think there's anything verifiable or falsifiable about it. But you do get some interesting cases where people allegedly will see things that can be verified, where they will say things like, oh, I floated out of my body, and then I floated into the floor above and then 2 rooms down, and I saw that there was this guy who was getting his leg amputated, and there was a doctor who was wearing a blue coat who then put the leg in a yellow bag and then moved it. And then when they wake up and tell people this, they find out that at the exact same time there was this going on, and it's like, well, either they heard it from somewhere, they got lucky, or there was leading questions. I mean, sometimes it's just hard to verify, because even if they get it right, there's the question of like, well, is there information that they were exposed to that they didn't know? Did people ask leading questions, or they just say it? So a lot of it's very hard to know, which is why I don't think it's usually as strong. But there are studies, I believe there was one study done where they had patients who had claimed to have near-death experiences where they a lot of times you'll have it where people will see them and they'll describe resuscitation, right? They'll describe, I was floating by my body and I was looking down and I saw the doctor and they were patting on my chest and doing all this stuff and then reviving me, right? And then they come back. And some people said, well, maybe this is just people guessing, right? That they're just, oh, they've seen it on TV. This is normal stuff. But some of the stuff they say is pretty specific, like the instruments and stuff they use are not what you would normally see in TV. And so the study had it to where they had people who had had these near-death experiences describe their resuscitation. And then they had people who had been resuscitated, their heart stopped, but they did not have an NDE that they remembered. And they just said, how do you think the resuscitation process did? Explain it to me. Like, if you could, to the best of your ability, how would you figure it went? And the people who had near-death experiences were far more accurate with the details than the people who were just guessing and just making it up, right? Who just were just presuming it. So I think there is something there in terms of people not just misremembering this, but there might be actually something there. But yeah, there are some really interesting cases like that. And there are a handful of cases where there's healing afterwards. One more thing I'll show you in the slide that I do have, because I had a near-death experience portion on this. Let me see if I can get to it. Near-death experiences. We'll skip that one we'll do that for the resurrection one. But there's a study published in the Journal of Near-Death Studies where they talk about a corroborated healing. And I have the title of it up there if anyone wants to look at it. But there was a patient who he had, I think, a separate cancer that he was getting treated for. He was 60 years old. And his heart stopped and they had to revive him and he came back. And he was able to successfully describe his resuscitation and stuff like that. The doctor was impressed. And they also learned that while he was having his near-death experience, he saw himself in heaven. He thought he saw his dead dad. And he said he saw a man in white who was glowing, who he thought looked kind of like Jesus. He wasn't sure. I don't think he was overly religious, but he was like, he presumed it was Jesus. When he came back, the doctors had found out that when he'd been born with cerebral palsy, right, which is a neurological condition and has different degrees of severity, but he had a withered hand, kind of like the guy in the gospel that Jesus heals. And his hand had basically been in a permanent flex of a wrist. His muscles had been atrophied. He hadn't been able to use his hand since birth for 60 years. He sometimes wore splints, but he said it didn't work, and it was just there, but it never actually had any management. So we know that he came in like this, but when he woke up from the NDE, very rapidly he was able to move his hand again and he got muscle tone. And the doctors looked and they checked when he got out of rehab. It's like, did he ever do any exercise for his hand? Like, no, we never did any hand exercises, but they did confirm that the muscle tone and the mobility of the hand returned right when he had been revived. And so the paper goes through this and they said, yeah, there's no natural explanation. Cerebral palsy doesn't go away. It's a permanent condition. And there's no precedent for someone who's had decades of paralysis of an appendage with, atrophied tendons to that degree, suddenly being able to open it and move it around. Prior to that, he'd only been able to do that very limitedly. But he talked about how he had pretty much full range. He didn't need a splint or anything now. So I don't think it's the strongest case, but it's really interesting, and it was published in a medical journal. So it's one of those where they're just like, yeah, this is really weird. And they didn't have an explanation for the healing, but it is fascinating. It's funny because in this series of papers, there's a back and forth. There was a skeptic who posted a response paper, and he and most of it wasn't about that aspect of it. It was about other things. And he had like a paragraph or two about, well, do we know the person was actually like sick before that? And then the author of this paper posted a response to his response where she defended that. And then when he posted a second response, he dropped the issue with the healing. He attacked other things, but he didn't address what her response was. So presumably the person who was defending this got the last word on it. So it is interesting, and I think that's a really fascinating case that was published for anyone who wants to go read about it. But yeah, there's a near-death experience that has some kind of external confirmation, that is fascinating. And a lot of these happen and just aren't reported. And I think these are more common than people think, but often we just don't talk about them.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a vague topic, but it's even more definite that it's a super interesting and I would say very important topic for all of us. We can be Christians or members of other religions or just completely skeptics and towards anything out there when it comes to supernatural. But when you hear stories after stories, testimony after testimony of people, and I've listened to a number of these on YouTube all these years, people say, hey, I was a patient in this hospital, these were my doctors, this was happening to me, I was having heart surgery, brain surgery, I don't know, I was in a coma, I felt like my spirit was hovering or even leaving the hospital. And then I saw the top of the hospital. I saw like an item, an object, maybe let's say, well, I don't want to just assume, but it can be anything that is so specific. Let's
There's one
say
with a quarter for. There's one with a quarter where a guy sees on top of this like 8 foot tall medical machine. He sees a quarter and he says he knows the date on it. It was like 1975. And the doctor, he wakes up. He's like, oh, there's a quarter up there. And she's like, what? She goes up there and it was dusty. It hadn't been touched in a while. It got the year right on it. So you have stuff like that where you'll have things like that where they see weird things that you wouldn't think to notice.
Yeah, so when someone is able to give details like that, so they're not guessing, they're not let's say even though in coma, they're still somehow able to hear doctors or nurses talking about something. Let's say there was a I don't know, there was an important basketball game. So they heard the result even though they're sleeping. So somehow they heard. No, this is like an information that no one knew. It was beyond the knowledge or the abilities to know of the people who were present in that room. So the person levitated. The person left their body, maybe in a similar way, like John left, so he would see a certain revelation and being able to write it down. So this person's spirit left the body for a certain amount of time, came back and gave this information. And I'm always amazed at these stories because regardless of how much I can be skeptical, when you have information like this, I think it's undeniable that something supernatural happened. And I would just because we won't dedicate as much time to the near death experience as we dedicated to miracles and healings. I would encourage people to go and listen to different Christian well-known scholars like Dr. Habermas, who was in numerous videos on YouTube. He was talking about this, including in one of the videos when he was guest on Capturing Christianity, just like you were a guest on
Yeah.
this channel. Then we have a famous. He's not a scholar, but he's a former journalist and an apologist, Lee Strobel, talking about this. We had Sean McDowell. We had all these people who some of these are more trained in philosophy and theology and apologetics than others, but still their work is credible. They don't just write about assumptions. They want to have all this information backed up by data, just like what you're doing in your work, and which I love and admire. So I would just encourage people to go and check some of these names on YouTube and just check for those near death experience accounts. Now, these patients or these people who have went through near death experiences, they're not always Christians, but that's I think less important in this story. What's important for me is that not all these people. I don't want to say all these people. Many people said, "Hey, I went into coma. I was in surgery. I had surgery. This happened to me. I saw nothing. I witnessed nothing. Because I'm not just watching YouTube videos. I'm also reading comments when it comes to important topics. So many people say, "Hey, I was there. I saw and heard nothing." But I'm like, but there's also a numerous number of accounts where people saw some angelic or divine figures. They felt something. They heard something. And they were able to either retrieve information which they were not able to get in any other shape or form, or maybe they experienced this divine healing or peace where they will have this angelic figure that will calm them down and they will wake up from surgery and they'll be like almost a different person, like because of that divine or paranormal experience. So I think this contributes to the topic of miracles and just life after that many religions believe, not just Christianity.
Yeah, and I'll just plug the best book on this topic is called, I have it back there and I forgot to grab it. It's called The Self Does Not Die, and it has every like major account you can think of that has corroboration, where they have page after page. I think they have close to 100 or so. I don't know, like a lot of accounts. They tell you the doctor's names. They tell you how verified, if it was a first-hand witness, second-hand, all that stuff. Really interesting. It's probably the most thorough book on near-death experiences to date. So I'd really recommend that for anyone who's interested in the topic.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to say, because we're almost done for tonight. Well, first, Caleb, I really enjoyed tonight, and time went fast, and we learned so much from you. And I'm very thankful for you having time for the audience and for myself. But the second thing, I also wanna I will post the information about your work on Amazon so people can go and support you, buy your books. I'm looking forward for the next year where you're hoping to release two books on these topics that we talked about tonight. And lastly, I would also like to welcome you and invite you for the next time where we can talk more about these interesting topics. Hoping that we can cover everything, or at least a portion of things that we couldn't cover for tonight. But I also want to give you as much time as you want to have, just to give some concluding thoughts on whatever we touched upon tonight. So maybe you didn't feel you spoke enough, or maybe as an encouraging thought, I mean, encouraging message to the viewers when it comes to miracles, healings, near-death experience. What would be your message to the audience?
Well, yeah. First, I'd say thanks again for having me on, and this is really great. I'd be more than happy to come back again. This is a great experience, and you're a wonderful host, and so I really do thank you for that opportunity. In terms of closing thoughts, I would say that I would always encourage people to pray for healing, even if you're not a Christian, even if you're not a believer. Prayer does have good mental health effects in terms of reducing stress and stuff like that. That's general and controversial, and just hold on to that kind of faith. And I would also say that if you are praying for healing, please do not ever forgo medical care for that. Always be trying to combine prayer with medicine. So please don't ignore doctors. Don't say that taking medicine is somehow a lack of faith. Let us remember that Luke, in many people in the Gospels, Luke was a doctor. Paul told Timothy to drink some wine to help his stomach ache. We can have medicine and also have prayer. So please don't ever not take medicine because you think you're healed or because you want God to heal you, right? I think those kinds of miracles are rare, and they only happen in cases where medical care has been tried and has been absolutely ineffective and has never worked. So I just want to point that out there just for safety precautions, because there are people, unfortunately, who go to faith healers and think they're healed and they're not, and they seriously hurt or even kill themselves, and that's horribly tragic. And I would never want to give anyone that impression that I would be defending that. So that's how I would leave it with. And for people who are sick, I admit that I'm talking from a point of privilege here. I am relatively healthy. I try to exercise every day. I don't have any major disabilities. And I know there's people that it's easy for me to talk about these things, right? About God not healing some people. But there are people who are disabled, who have horrible birth defects, who are in wheelchairs their whole lives, who are on permanent disability. And I admit that I never know what that's like. And me telling you that God has a reason for that might not mean much, because who am I to say anything about that? So I think there's so much sympathy and empathy that can be had there, and that we really should relate to those people and share in their suffering. Although it's possible that God can heal you, God may not heal you, and you know what? That might not be your fault if He doesn't. It may be that there's a different reason for that, and we just have to hold on to that. But I believe that God can use that disability to His glory and to better your life, regardless of what it is. And again, I know I'm not in a position to talk about that because I'm relatively abled, but I do pray for anyone with those conditions that they will receive either spiritual or physical healing, or perhaps both in that way.
Caleb, that was a wonderful, and I would even say pastoral conclusion, because we want to make sure that people are holistically doing well spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically. And I wholeheartedly agree with you. I remember when we talked about this topic numerous times in my Moody days. Please do not allow those priests or pastors or your Christian friends who would tell you that you're not allowed to take medicine. You're not supposed to go to a hospital, see your doctor because you lack faith, or because A, B, C, D, E, whatever. Do your research, pray, get consulted. Don't be ashamed if you need to go see a therapist. Take care of your mental health, take care of your emotional, spiritual, and physical health as well. But do not think that you have to make choice either between medicine and science or faith. That's a false dichotomy. It's a false choice. God gave us both, so there's no choice. You can enjoy the pleasures, the benefits, and the blessings that God gave us in all these different aspects of life. That being said, Caleb, thank you once again. I would just invite everyone to subscribe, like, share this video because it will help the algorithm. Our channel is relatively young. We have around 250 subscribers, and I'm blessed and thankful for all of you. And please, support Caleb's work. I shall be posting a video. I mean, not video. Link to his work, material, and books, so you can buy and support him because authors who are intellectually honest and well prepared and willing to go to the end, regardless of what the data is showing, who are trying to be not biased, they deserve to be promoted and supported. And Caleb is one of them. So, brother, thank you once again. God bless, and I shall see you next time.
God bless.